Thomas the Tank Engine, a show beloved by many and definitely my favorite show growing up. It first aired in the UK in 1984, 10 years before I was born. I grew up with the stories narrated by Ringo Starr, George Carlin, and Alec Baldwin. Everybody else who narrated, yeah, they suck. Except Pierce Brosnan. Dude was the shit. Everybody's #1 blue train was everyone's best friend. It is a show that to this day still teaches the value of truth, honesty, respect, loyalty, friendship. Okay, it did when I was a kid, but I'm not too sure now since I'm a grown man and outgrew the show a decade and a half ago. I just know the show is now CGI bullshit, but nostalgia isn't what I'm here to talk about. Sure, it looks strange that those trains had faces with mouths that didn't move, and could be punished by human beings, and it looked like a scene out of a shittier horror movie than horror movies we receive nowadays. As stated before, I'm not here to talk about the nostalgia factor of this show and how it brings me back to my childhood just talking about it. So why talk about it? Not only did I grow up with this, but I was browsing my Twitter feed yesterday and came across 3 tweets about Thomas. One was a joke about a scene in the story Come Out Henry, previously titled The Sad Story of Henry for UK audiences, about the green engine named Henry being bricked up in a tunnel by the manager of the railway, Sir Topham Hatt, or the Fat Controller if you live in the UK, also known as the Monopoly Guy. Because Henry didn't want to spoil his green paint because of the rain. It is heavily implied in the UK version that Henry is to stay in the tunnel for good. Check it out in the clip.
"We shall take away your rails," he said, "and leave you here for always and always and always." They took up the old rails and built a wall in front of him so that Henry couldn't get out of the tunnel anymore. All he could do was watch the trains rushing through the other tunnel. He was very sad because he thought no one would ever see his lovely green paint with red stripes again. As time went on, Edward and Gordon would often pass by. Edward would say, "Peep, peep, hello." And Gordon would say, "Poop, poop, poop, serves you right." Poor Henry had no steam to answer. His fire had gone out. Sudden dirt from the tunnel had spoiled his lovely green paint and red stripes anyway. He wondered if he would ever be allowed to pull trains again. But I think he deserved his punishment. Don't you?
Now I'll come back around to this in a minute, but there is another tweet that I saw which involved the story Toad Stands By, in which Oliver pulls apart a freight car, the leader of the troublesome trucks, who is their ring bearer and allows the freight cars to make fun of the engines, and Oliver pulls him apart. And it was another tweet that showed just how horrific and how gruesome this show can be. I mean, in the scene, there's no blood or gore or anything, and this whole analysis of it really doesn't make any sense to me that this scene is torture porn, because they're fucking trains, for Christ's sake! My idea to do a video like this is a third tweet I saw that had a link to an article in the New Yorker about Thomas the Tank Engine, called The Repressive Authoritarian Soul of Thomas the Tank Engine, trying to argue whether or not this show was really set in a dystopian... The subject as to whether or not this show is a dystopian future has been brought up before, but that was several years ago, and it really flew right under the radar. This was 3 tweets that I saw about the show in one day in a span of 2 minutes, and it really got me thinking after reading this article. People are really looking too far into this show to think that it's dystopian future. Do these people make valid arguments? Yes, the article in the New Yorker states that the author of the original Thomas the Tank Engine books disliked change, venerated order, and craved the administration of punishment, which to an extent in the show is true. A lot of the trains do get punished in the show, But you have to have somebody there in a world with anthropomorphic talking fucking trains to give them order. And to anyone thinking that that scene with Oliver pulling apart the freight car Scruffy is torture porn and gory and just trains settling conflict, well, look at this fucking scene! Scruffy is alive and well! And when Henry got shut up in the tunnel and you thought, oh my god, that's like a death sentence for trains, this show promotes punishment and death, this shouldn't be taught to our kids, it's not moral. Well, guess what? Henry got out of the tunnel in the next episode and he got to pull the express because Gordon had a valve leaking. This goes back to the UK version of Come Out Henry. In Come Out Henry, in the UK version, The Sad Story of Henry, it is heavily implied that Henry is to stay in the tunnel for always and that he deserved his punishment. In the US version, this is changed to the point where Sir Topham Hatt says, we'll take away your rails and leave you there till you're ready to come out. And the ending ends a little bit more on a happy note, with the narrator saying, how long do you think Henry will stay in the tunnel before he overcomes his fear of the rain and then decides the journey out again, whereas the UK version is a little more bleak. Another piece of evidence for this is in the Railway series book, Stepney the Lost Engine, in a story called The Bluebells of England, in which Percy the Small Engine is singing a song that Douglas hears, and he tells Douglas about this scrapyard where engines are cut up and dismembered and sold into scrap. Now, the fan theory involving this picture from that particular story in the book is a Tumblr user saying that the whole Island of Sodor world that Thomas and his friends live on is actually a post-train apocalypse where trains are dismembered and cannibalized. Now, even I will admit that that photo is definitely a dark and disturbing image for a children's book, let alone a children's book about talking trains, but I just don't see the argument as to how it's a dystopian world. That's a weird fan theory to me. I mean, sure, those trains look scared shitless and one has no face, and it's probably, yeah, that guy with the blowtorch is probably like, so, what part of you do you want me to blow tonight? But taking that photo out of the context, I don't really see how Thomas the Tank Engine can be dystopian. Society is flourishing in this world. There was no devastating event that caused society to crumble and then rebuild itself with anthropomorphic trains. I don't think that's the intention here, and I wish people would just kind of leave dystopian narratives out of children's shows. They're children's shows for a reason, because children want to enjoy them. So while the evidence is there for Thomas the Tank Engine to be a dystopian universe, and people could think that it is, I just don't see it, except for this fucking picture! Holy shit, that is fucking creepy! It hasn't really forced me to look at this children's show that I used to love in a new way. I look at it the same as I did when I was a little kid. Keep the dystopian narratives for the feature films that need them, like Blade Runner and Ghost in the Shell and stuff like that. Keep it out of children's shows like Thomas the Tank Engine. For one, they're anthropomorphic trains. Two, it's Thomas the fucking Tank Engine! I love Shining Time Station back in the day. It's Thomas the Tank Engine! To end this dystopian talk of Thomas the Tank Engine on a positive note, I just want to say one thing. This CGI bullshit. This model train badassery that was ahead of its time in 1984. Guys, thank you for taking the time to watch this. This is actually, I wanted to share a bit of my childhood with you. What I watched when I was a child, and I saw this article and I was just like, I don't really agree with that, and I figured this would probably get some conversations going, so thank you very much. I'll have Blade Runner 2049, a review for that up next week, possibly a review of the old Blade Runner as well. You guys are awesome. You can like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter, if you're on YouTube, subscribe, and I really hope you like this video.